From the earliest days of the Republic, Rome was not content with its small patch of land in central Italy. The city, born on the banks of the Tiber, was ambitious, disciplined, and ruthless in its desire for dominance. What began as a small settlement gradually became the nucleus of an empire that would stretch across Europe, North Africa, and the Near East. But Rome's expansion was not simply a matter of geography. It was a carefully calculated strategy to control populations, exploit resources, and consolidate power. Each conquest, each battlefield victory, carried not just the weight of military triumph, but also the careful orchestration of political, social, and psychological control over those who fell under Roman rule. Rome's campaigns were meticulously organized. Legions, trained not just as soldiers but as disciplined instruments of the state, moved with precision across the Italian peninsula and beyond. Roman commanders understood that brute force alone was not enough. Fear, negotiation, and the promise of reward were equally vital tools. When the Romans encountered a new city or tribe, they often presented the inhabitants with a stark choice: submission or annihilation. If a people surrendered, they were typically allowed to retain some autonomy, but under strict Roman oversight. Tribute would be extracted, taxes imposed, and local leaders often co-opted into Rome's administrative system. Resistance, on the other hand, was met with extreme measures. Cities were razed, populations enslaved, and the social structures of the defeated obliterated. The conquest of enemy lands was as much about erasing rival identities as it was about territorial expansion. Rome had an almost obsessive approach to controlling memory and narrative. When a city fell, its temples, monuments, and archives were often destroyed or repurposed to serve Roman purposes. Native gods might be subsumed into the Roman pantheon, while the histories of defeated peoples were either rewritten or erased. The logic was simple. A population without its history, its leaders, and its symbols of pride was easier to control. And at the heart of this erasure were the people themselves, particularly those who represented the continuity of the old order. Among the most strategically valuable and most vulnerable were the women of the conquered cities, especially the daughters of leaders and influential families. These young women were not only symbols of their people's status, but also potential instruments of Roman strategy. Marriages, alliances, and even forced labor were ways Rome used them to secure loyalty and prevent rebellion. The Romans understood that conquering a city physically was only half the battle. Ensuring that its people would not rise against them required psychological mastery. Controlling the daughters of the elite was one method of achieving this. They became living guarantees of submission, bound into Roman families, households, or at times the imperial harem. Rome's expansion, however, was never uniform. Different regions required different approaches. In Gaul, for instance, conquest often involved brutal military campaigns against tribal confederations, followed by the integration of local leaders into the Roman provincial system. In the Eastern Mediterranean, diplomacy and client kingships were more common, with Rome exercising influence through local rulers who owed their positions to Roman approval. Regardless of the method, the underlying principle was consistent. Rome sought to dominate not just the land, but the people who inhabited it. Each conquest carried the implicit message that resistance was not only futile, but morally and socially destructive. The psychological dimension of Roman conquest cannot be understated. Triumphs, the grand processions celebrating military victories, served as both entertainment and propaganda. Captured soldiers, artisans, and notably, women were paraded through Rome, their suffering displayed as proof of Roman superiority. These spectacles were designed to reinforce the idea that Rome's expansion was inevitable and its enemies utterly powerless. For the citizens of Rome, the display of conquered peoples was thrilling and morally reassuring, transforming real human suffering into a spectacle of civic pride. For the conquered, it was humiliating, demoralizing, and in many cases, life-altering. Economic motives also played a significant role in expansion. Conquered territories provided not just tribute, but also access to vital resources: grain from Sicily, silver from Spain, timber from Gaul. Rome's appetite for wealth was insatiable, and the empire's military campaigns were carefully designed to secure these economic advantages. The wealth extracted from conquered lands funded further campaigns, public works, and the luxurious lifestyles of the Roman elite, creating a self-reinforcing cycle of expansion and exploitation. Yet Rome's power was not merely imposed from above, it often co-opted local cooperation. Many conquered elites were absorbed into Roman political structures, serving as magistrates, tax collectors, or military officers. This integration created a veneer of inclusion, masking the underlying domination. By offering rewards and status to those who complied, Rome reduced the likelihood of rebellion and ensured that its influence penetrated deeply into the social fabric of newly acquired territories. Despite its strategic brilliance, Rome's expansion came with human costs that were rarely acknowledged in the historical record. Families were torn apart, children orphaned, cities burned, and entire cultures displaced. The men who survived often became slaves, the women sometimes absorbed into Roman households, and the children raised under the shadow of a foreign conqueror. These were not incidental tragedies. They were integral to Rome's conception of empire. The destruction of autonomy, the subjugation of peoples, and the careful manipulation of memory were all essential tools in constructing a world in which Roman dominance was absolute and self-perpetuating. In sum, the expansion of Roman power was a multifaceted enterprise. It combined military brilliance, strategic diplomacy, psychological manipulation, and economic exploitation. It was not merely about conquering land, but about controlling people, reshaping societies, and ensuring that Rome's authority was felt and remembered, and that the identities and histories of its enemies were systematically diminished. Every city razed, every family subjugated, every daughter of a defeated leader forced into Roman hands was part of a larger design, a design that transformed the Mediterranean world into a Roman-dominated order, one that would endure for centuries. In this world, the conquered were visible only as instruments of Rome's glory, and their suffering, particularly that of women and children, was intentionally left unrecorded or forgotten. It was a calculated expansion, as brutal as it was brilliant, a system in which power was both exercised and displayed, and in which memory itself became a tool of domination in the Roman worldview. Conquest was never solely about territory, it was about control of land, resources, and above all, people. Among the most strategically significant yet overlooked of these people were women, particularly the daughters of the defeated elite. For Rome, these women were more than individuals, they were symbols of their family's power, carriers of social capital, and most importantly, tools to secure obedience. To understand the Roman approach to conquered women, one must see the empire as a machine that consumed not only land but lineage, using human relationships as instruments of political domination. The daughters of enemy leaders occupied a precarious space in this system. On one hand, they were highly valued for their symbolic significance. They represented the continuity of families and the cohesion of defeated polities. On the other hand, they were powerless in the face of Rome's ambition. By controlling these young women, Rome could manipulate entire families and communities, marrying them into Roman households, placing them under the guardianship of loyal officials, or even integrating them into the households of Roman generals, were all strategies designed to consolidate influence. Their subjugation was not incidental, it was a deliberate tactic, carefully woven into the broader strategy of imperial control. Historical records offer glimpses into this practice, though often in fragments or through the lens of male-centered narratives. In the aftermath of major military campaigns, it was common for daughters of captured nobles to be removed from their homes and dispersed. Some were married off to Roman officers as a reward for loyalty or valor, while others were held as political hostages. These marriages were rarely about personal affection, they were transactions. A daughter's allegiance was transferred to Rome through the bonds of matrimony, ensuring that her family would comply with Roman demands or risk dishonor and further punishment. The psychological weight of this practice was immense. A single young woman could carry the fate of an entire lineage, her marriage functioning as a silent treaty between conqueror and conquered. Rome's use of women as political instruments extended beyond the battlefield. Even in the cities of the Mediterranean that had been long under Roman influence, daughters of prominent families were used to cement alliances between influential households. Wealthy Roman senators sought marriages with these women not only for prestige, but also to strengthen their political networks. For conquered families, acquiescence was a survival tactic. Refusing a marriage arranged by Rome could result in exile, confiscation of property, or worse, elimination of the family's male leadership. In this way, women became both bargaining chips and bridges, facilitating a tenuous peace while reinforcing the hierarchical structure that Rome imposed on every aspect of society. The tragedy of this system lies in the personal cost to the women themselves. Historical accounts rarely convey their voices, and when they do, it is often filtered through the perspectives of male historians who prioritize Roman glory over individual suffering. We can imagine the lives of these daughters, uprooted from their homes, their families, and their familiar customs, thrust into foreign households, and constantly reminded that their value was measured not in their aspirations or abilities, but in their usefulness as instruments of power. Some may have tried to assert influence within these new households, navigating the treacherous waters of Roman social politics, but their agency was always constrained by the structures of domination that surrounded them. The use of women as instruments of strategy was not limited to marriage alone. Rome often placed them in roles that were intended to assert dominance over their communities. They could be made examples in public ceremonies, displayed during triumphs, or assigned positions within elite households where they functioned as both symbols and enforcers of Roman authority. Their presence alone was a reminder of the conqueror's reach, a living testament to the futility of resistance. For the local population, seeing daughters of their leaders integrated into Roman society, whether through marriage or servitude, was a powerful psychological tool. It reinforced the idea that opposition to Rome was not only dangerous but ultimately meaningless. It is also crucial to recognize the long-term political ramifications of these strategies. Daughters married into Roman households could influence policy, succession, and social dynamics from within, even if their lives were circumscribed by cultural and legal constraints. Some managed to preserve elements of their native identity, subtly influencing the Romans around them. In certain cases, their offspring, mixed by bloodline but raised in Roman culture, could inherit both privilege and responsibility, becoming intermediaries between Rome and conquered peoples. These outcomes were unpredictable, but they demonstrate how women, though often silenced in historical narratives, could exert influence in subtle yet meaningful ways. Rome's treatment of conquered daughters also reveals the empire's understanding of human psychology and loyalty. By controlling these women, Rome essentially held the key to compliance. Families were less likely to rebel when they knew that their daughters' futures, and by extension their own honor, were bound to Roman hands. This method of control was far more effective and enduring than purely military domination. It created a network of loyalty that was both intimate and coercive, embedding Rome's authority deeply into the social fabric of conquered territories. Yet, for all its effectiveness, this strategy came at a cost: the erasure of personal histories, desires, and identities. The daughters of enemies became invisible in the historical record, remembered only insofar as they intersected with the lives of Roman men. Their stories were overshadowed by the narrative of Roman conquest, their voices muted by the triumphalist lens of imperial historiography. The very success of Rome's political strategy depended on this erasure. The conquered were integrated, controlled, and often forgotten, while Rome's power remained the central, enduring story. In the end, women as instruments of political strategy embody the intersection of power, gender, and memory in the Roman Empire. They were both pawns and protectors, victims and silent influencers. By controlling their marriages, movements, and visibility, Rome could shape the social and political landscapes of entire regions. The daughters of defeated leaders were reminders that conquest was not only about armies and cities, but also about lineage, loyalty, and the delicate negotiation of human relationships. In this light, the history of Rome is incomplete without acknowledging the strategic, often tragic role these women played, A role that was crucial to the empire's expansion, yet deliberately obscured by the chroniclers of the time. Conquest is rarely just a matter of winning battles. It is about asserting authority, reinforcing hierarchy, and ensuring that victory is remembered and feared. For Rome, the act of defeating an enemy was only the beginning. The empire's brilliance and brutality lay in its mastery of spectacle, the deliberate, often ritualized humiliation of the conquered, designed to make subjugation both visible and indelible. These rituals were not mere displays of cruelty, they were carefully calculated exercises in domination, aimed at breaking the spirit of defeated peoples, reinforcing Roman supremacy, and turning human suffering into a tool of governance. The most famous of these rituals was the Roman triumph, a grand public procession celebrating military victories. Generals who had conquered enemy territories were awarded this honor, parading through the streets of Rome in a dramatic, almost theatrical display. At the heart of the triumph were the spoils of war, gold, treasures, captured arms, and most disturbingly, living prisoners. Among these captives were men, women, and sometimes children, often the daughters and wives of defeated leaders. Marching through Rome in chains, they were presented as trophies, proof of Rome's invincibility and the futility of resistance. Their humiliation was intentional and calculated. The more visibly defeated and subjugated the enemy, the greater the glory for Rome and its leaders. Women, particularly, were subjected to specific forms of public display. They were often paraded as symbols of the conquered people's submission, their status reduced from daughters of nobility to possessions of the state. Some were taken directly into the households of victorious generals, their public humiliation extended into private domains. Others were assigned to temples or religious ceremonies, further reinforcing their symbolic role as markers of conquest. The psychological impact on both the captives and the witnessing population was profound. For the conquered, it was a demonstration of helplessness. For the Roman populace, it was both entertainment and affirmation of civic pride. Beyond parades, Rome employed other forms of ritualized domination that were more subtle but equally effective. In cities recently conquered, local leaders and their families could be compelled to attend official ceremonies, swear oaths of loyalty, or participate in sacrifices and public events orchestrated by Roman authorities. Such rituals served multiple purposes. They reinforced the authority of the conqueror, demonstrated the compliance of the conqueror, and created a visible, almost theatrical hierarchy that left little doubt about who held power. Even in ostensibly peaceful provinces, these ceremonies reminded the population that resistance would not go unnoticed, and that submission to Rome was absolute. The symbolic power of these rituals extended beyond immediate humiliation. By incorporating conquered peoples into public events, Rome effectively rewrote the social narrative. A daughter of a vanquished king, once a symbol of her own city's autonomy, could now be displayed in Rome as a sign of its people's subjugation. Their presence transformed historical and familial significance into political propaganda, reinforcing the idea that Rome did not just conquer territory, it conquered memory, identity, and legacy. In this way, ritualized domination was as much about rewriting history as it was about celebrating victory. The psychological dimensions of these practices cannot be overstated. By turning human suffering into spectacle, Rome created a climate of fear that transcended generations. Conquered populations were left with a permanent imprint of subordination, a visual and emotional reminder that opposition to Roman authority was futile and potentially catastrophic. This fear was reinforced through carefully staged punishments, public executions, and even theatrical reenactments of battles, where defeated soldiers and leaders were humiliated or killed in front of crowds. The empire's power was thus demonstrated not only through military might, but through the mastery of perception, ensuring that victory remained total both physically and psychologically. Women, as central figures in these rituals, bore a unique and particularly poignant burden. Their captivity and visibility in public ceremonies were designed to assert the conqueror's dominance while simultaneously undermining the authority of their families. A daughter paraded in chains or assigned to a Roman household was a living symbol of defeat, her body and status weaponized to signal compliance. In many cases, this served as a direct deterrent to rebellion. If resistance meant that daughters and wives would be subjected to public humiliation, families were far more likely to acquiesce. The control of women, therefore, was not incidental to Roman strategy. It was essential, intricately tied to both political and military objectives. Religious elements often reinforced these acts of domination. Conquered peoples were sometimes forced to participate in Roman religious rituals, sacrifices, and ceremonies that symbolically placed their lives and cities under the authority of Rome and its gods. This served both to erode indigenous religious practices and to demonstrate that Roman rule was sanctioned by divine authority. Women could be incorporated into these rituals as offerings, attendants, or symbols of the conquered people's submission, further blurring the lines between political control and sacred spectacle. Despite the cruelty inherent in these practices, Rome's use of ritualized humiliation was not haphazard. Each act was carefully calibrated to serve a strategic purpose, to assert dominance, deter rebellion, and reinforce the social and political hierarchy in the eyes of both the conquered and the conquerors. In this way, Rome transformed acts of cruelty into instruments of governance, creating a system where humiliation, on itself, became a form of policy. Victory was not merely about winning a war, it was about demonstrating to all that resistance was both pointless and perilous. Yet, the stories of those subjected to these rituals, the women, children, and families, were rarely recorded in detail. Ancient historians, largely male and Roman, focused on triumphs, victories, and the glory of generals. The suffering of captives, the trauma of women forced into foreign households, and the emotional toll on communities were often minimized or ignored. As a result, the lives of these individuals exist mostly as shadows in the historical record, visible in the acts they were forced to endure, but silent in their own voices. Their erasure was part of the system itself. The spectacle served to glorify Rome, while the humanity of the victims was deliberately obscured. In the end, Rome's rituals of humiliation and domination reveal a deeply calculated approach to power, one that relied not only on the sword, but on theater, psychology, and social control. Conquered daughters and wives were more than passive victims. They were central figures in the empire's strategy of governance, their lives transformed into tools for asserting authority, enforcing obedience, and rewriting social narratives. Through these rituals, Rome ensured that conquest was total, not only in terms of land, but in terms of memory, identity, and societal structure. The empire's triumphs were thus inseparable from the suffering they orchestrated, and the spectacle of domination was as crucial to Rome's enduring power as the legions that marched into battle. Conquest is never merely a physical act, it is a narrative one. To truly dominate a people, Rome understood it was not enough to defeat them on the battlefield or parade their women and children through the streets of the capital. True domination required controlling memory itself, who would be remembered, who would be forgotten, and whose stories would be told. The daughters of defeated leaders, women whose lives had been turned into instruments of Roman power, were often the first to be erased. Their suffering, their sacrifices, and their silent resilience were systematically obscured, leaving the historical record dominated by Roman triumphs and the glory of generals. While the victims themselves faded into near-total invisibility, the mechanisms of this erasure were subtle but profoundly effective. Roman historians, men writing for Roman audiences, rarely acknowledged the experiences of women outside Rome itself. Livy, Tacitus, and Cassius Dio, among others, focused on political strategy, military campaigns, and the character of Roman leaders. The lives of captive women, the daughters of defeated kings and generals, were only mentioned insofar as they served the narrative of Roman success. Their names were often omitted, their experiences reduced to footnotes, and their humanity subordinated to the spectacle of conquest. In essence, history itself became a tool of domination, reinforcing the power structures that had caused their suffering. This deliberate forgetting served a purpose. By erasing the memory of conquered women, Rome maintained the illusion of total control. If the public narrative emphasized Roman victory and divine sanction while ignoring the trauma inflicted on women and children, the empire appeared not only omnipotent, but orally justified. These women were transformed into symbols rather than individuals, representations of submission, trophies of power, and instruments in political propaganda. Their personal stories, which might have offered resistance or complexity, were intentionally suppressed to preserve the clarity and inevitability of Roman triumph. Erasure also functioned socially. In the provinces, conquered families had to navigate the uncomfortable balance between survival and honor. By controlling which narratives were recorded or remembered, Rome ensured that the population internalized its authority. A father or brother might be unable to publicly lament the fate of a daughter or sister without risking the perception of weakness or inciting suspicion from Roman overseers. Silence became a form of compliance, and forgetting became a survival strategy. Over time, this enforced silence transformed collective memory. Communities might remember that defeat had occurred, but the experiences of women, the human cost of conquest, were rendered invisible, absorbed into the broader impersonal narrative of Rome's expansion. Even monuments and inscriptions reinforced this erasure. Triumphal arches, columns, and public art celebrated victories, often depicting captured enemies in stylized symbolic forms rather than as individuals with names, lives, or agency. Women were shown as part of the spoils, anonymous and objectified, their identities erased even as their subjugation was made visible. In these works, the focus was always the victor, the Roman general, the city, or the emperor, and the message was clear: the conquered existed only insofar as they affirmed Roman superiority. Their ori was consumed by the narrative of empire, their personal histories overwritten by the grandeur of the conqueror. In addition to public art and literature, legal and social structures contributed to this erasure. Captive women were often absorbed into Roman households, their past identities minimized, and their new roles defined strictly by the needs of their captors. Marriages arranged by conquest were political tools, and within these unions, the histories and family ties of the women were subordinated to Roman lineage. Children born from these unions were raised as Romans, often with little knowledge of their maternal ancestry. In this way, memory was not only erased in the historical record, but actively reshaped through generations. The daughters of kings and generals became anonymous mothers of Roman citizens, their original identities systematically diluted or forgotten. Religion, too, played a role in this silencing. Women who were incorporated into temples or rituals often lost the ability to publicly assert any personal history. Their presence was symbolic rather than narrative. They represented conquered peoples, submission, or divine favor, rather than lived experiences. Any previous cultural or familial identity they carried was absorbed into the Roman religious framework, leaving no room for independent memory. Even acts of heroism or resistance could be reframed or erased, so that Roman ideology remained uncontested and dominant. This erasure was not only external but internal. Women themselves, aware of the consequences of defiance, were often forced to suppress their own memories, desires, and identities. Survival demanded adaptation, obedience, and sometimes forgetting. To speak out could provoke punishment for themselves or their remaining family members, while remembrance risked undermining their precarious position in Roman households. In this way, erasure was both a tool imposed by Rome and a strategy adopted by those who survived its domination, creating a cycle in which history remembered the victors and the victims were silenced twice over, first by conquest, then by necessity. Yet traces of these women's experiences survive, scattered across literature, archaeology, and oral traditions. Mentions of captive daughters, subtle allusions to forced marriages, or depictions in art hint at lives shaped by resilience and survival, even if the historical record fails to name them. These fragments remind us that memory is not entirely annihilated. It is contested, obscured and buried beneath layers of imperial narrative. Recovering their stories requires reading against the grain, interpreting absence as meaning, and recognizing that the history of conquest is incomplete without acknowledging those whose lives were rendered invisible. The systematic erasure of the daughters of defeated leaders illustrates a broader truth about Roman power. Domination was as much about controlling perception and memory as it was about military strength. By silencing the victims, Rome ensured that the narrative of conquest remained unchallenged, moralized, and glorified. Victory was eternal, suffering was invisible, and women, central to the strategies of political control, were largely written out of the story. In effect, Rome created a double conquest, one over territory and populations, and another over history itself. In conclusion, erasing the memory of the victims was a deliberate, strategic act, integral to the success and longevity of the Roman Empire. The daughters of conquered leaders were reduced to symbols, their stories overwritten by the grandeur of Roman triumphs. Their lives, suffering, and resilience existed largely in the shadows, leaving the historical record focused on the glory of conquest rather than the human cost. This deliberate forgetting served Rome's political, social, and psychological needs, ensuring that the empire's victories were celebrated while the personal tragedies of the conquered were concealed. In understanding this erasure, we begin to see not only the full scope of Rome's power, but also the hidden, often overlooked consequences of empire. The lives silenced, the histories forgotten, and the human cost that was never meant to be remembered, even when history has deliberately silenced the daughters of Rome's defeated enemies. Their presence and their influence remains woven into the fabric of the empire. Though they were often reduced to symbols, pawns, or instruments of political expedience, these women left an indelible, if invisible, mark on Roman society. Their legacy is a paradox. On one level, they were forgotten, their names and stories obscured by the grandeur of Roman triumphs. On another, their lives, marriages, and progeny subtly shaped alliances, politics, and even the succession of power across generations. To understand Rome fully, we must look beyond the legions and victories to the human consequences of conquest and the quiet yet profound ways the conquered endured, adapted, and influenced history. The most immediate legacy of these women was politic. When daughters of defeated rulers were integrated into Roman households, often through marriage or servitude, they became living links between the conquered and the conqueror. Their presence functioned as a guarantee of loyalty. Families whose daughters were absorbed into Roman life were less likely to resist, knowing that defiance might jeopardize the women they held most dear. Yet these same women, even under duress, wielded a subtle power. Through personal relationships, household management, and cultural knowledge, they could influence Roman elites in ways that were invisible to the public eye. The very strategies Rome used to control them, their integration into elite households, also allowed them to act as mediators, advisors, and at times, silent negotiators between conquered peoples and their Roman overlords. Marriage, in particular, was a vehicle of both control and influence. A daughter of a defeated king might marry a Roman officer or senator, ostensibly cementing political loyalty. However, these unions created hybrid social spaces where cultural negotiation occurred. The women brought knowledge of local customs, languages, and networks, which could prove valuable in maintaining order and governance in newly conquered territories. Through their children, who often inherited both Roman and native lineage, these women shaped the future of provincial elites, creating a generation that straddled two worlds. Though largely invisible in historical texts, the decisions, wisdom, and resilience of these women reverberated across families, regions, and even the empire itself. Their influence extended beyond politics and family. By living in Roman households, participating in domestic management, and observing elite practices, these women acquired knowledge and skills that allowed them to navigate and subtly manipulate the social structures around them. In many cases, they became indispensable to the functioning of Roman families, acting as advisors, cultural intermediaries, or managers of estates. Though this labor was rarely recognized or recorded, it shaped the economic and social order. The empire's reliance on these women, even if unacknowledged, demonstrates that conquest depended not only on military force, but also on the survival, labor, and ingenuity of the subjugated. Moreover, the legacy of these women can be seen in the gradual transformation of conquered societies. Through marriage and integration, the daughters of defeated elites helped to transmit Roman culture, language, and customs into provincial populations, accelerating the assimilation that characterized the empire. At the same time, they retained elements of their original identities, preserving knowledge, beliefs, and traditions within private or domestic spheres. This dual role, both conduits of Romanization and preservers of local identity, made them silent architects of cultural synthesis. The empire was built not only on legions and laws, but also on the quiet influence of these women, whose lives bridged conquered and conquering worlds. Yet the emotional and psychological consequences of their experiences were profound. The suffering endured, the forced separations, the public humiliations, the erasure of personal agency, created a legacy of trauma that likely resonated across families and generations. Children born into these unions carried the weight of dual heritage, often experiencing both the privileges of Roman elite life and the lingering stigma of their mother's status as a conquered captive. The resilience required to navigate these challenges, the strength needed to survive in a world that sought to erase their histories, constitutes a form of legacy that cannot be quantified, but is nonetheless essential to understanding the social dynamics of the empire. Despite their erasure from public memory, there are instances in which these women's influence emerges more visibly. Some ascended within Roman households to positions of authority, managing estates or guiding the education and upbringing of children who would later assume political or military roles. In other cases, their marriages created enduring alliances, shaping the balance of power between Roman families and provincial elites. Even when their contributions were unrecognized, they had a lasting effect on social networks, political negotiations, and the consolidation of imperial control. History may have muted their voices, but their impact was structural and enduring. The pattern of erasure also contributes to the modern perception of Rome, a civilization celebrated for law, engineering, and military might, but largely indifferent to the suffering it inflicted. Recognizing the legacy of these women allows a more nuanced understanding of the empire. It shows that Roman power was not just exercised through conquest and legislation, but also depended on the manipulation, integration, and often invisibilization of human lives. The daughters of defeated leaders were simultaneously victims and participants, erased from official memory but central to the functioning of the empire. Their suffering was not accidental, it was a deliberate instrument of control, yet even within this constrained role, they left a subtle yet profound mark on history. The long-term effects of this legacy are evident in the social and political structures of the empire. Provincial elites, many of whom were descended from these women or connected through their marriages, became intermediaries between Rome and local populations. They helped maintain order, collect taxes, and administer laws, often mediating tensions that might otherwise have led to rebellion. The daughters of defeated rulers, through their offspring and networks, contributed to a stable social order, ensuring that Rome's dominion persisted for centuries. Their influence may have been invisible in the historical record, but it was tangible in the endurance and integration of the empire itself. Finally, the legacy of forgotten suffering reminds us that history is never complete without considering those whom it silences. The daughters of conquered leaders exemplify how individuals can shape events and societies, even when deliberately excluded from memory. Their resilience, adaptability, and subtle influence reveal the human complexity behind imperial domination. By acknowledging their legacy, we gain a fuller understanding of Rome, not only as a conqueror of lands and armies, but also as a system that depended on the lives, labor, and endurance of the subjugated. The empire's glory was inseparable from the sacrifices it demanded, and the stories of these women, though largely unrecorded, remain a crucial part of that history. In sum, the legacy of the daughters of defeated enemies is both hidden and profound. Erased from historical narrative, yet enduring through marriage, progeny, and cultural influence, they shaped Roman society in ways that the empire itself could never openly acknowledge. Their suffering, resilience, and quiet agency remind us that the consequences of conquest extend far beyond the battlefield. Even when history forgets them, their influence endures, an invisible yet indelible thread in the vast tapestry of Rome's power and the human stories behind it.